Guests, welcome to the second installment of Engineers Without Borders Philippines webinar series, Build Back Better. I am Engineer Joshua Bonroco, your moderator for today. And we are very excited today because our topics are very insightful. But before I introduce our esteemed speakers, may I just remind everyone of some rules we have for the webinar. Please observe proper online etiquette. Mute your audio so we can hear the speakers properly. Don't forget to turn off your video during the webinar so that the speakers and the participants will not be distracted. At the end of the presentation, we shall be entertaining questions. You may type in your questions through the message box and I'll be reading them later. Please include your full name and affiliation in the question. And for those who will be watching in the YouTube Live, you can ask questions by clicking the Slido link provided in the video description. Finally, kindly accomplish the evaluation form to receive the certificate of participation. Links and instruction will be sent through the message box later. I think everyone's all excited, so we shall begin. Engineers Without Borders International has long been known as an organization for those aspiring to contribute to the society through the efficient implementation of engineering structures and innovations. Throughout the years, EWBI has branched out into numerous countries, allowing respective citizens to volunteer, donate, or register as members of the said organization. It enabled engineers with the same objective to connect with each other and help countless communities in need. Its primary vision is to build a sustainable world where engineering enables long-term positive social and global development for the benefit of people and the environment everywhere. EWB seeks to promote the collaboration so that collectively it can achieve more than the sum of its parts and fulfill its mission to be the beating heart of the engineering movement for sustainable global development, building and evolving engineering capacity throughout the world. Fortunately, EWB was able to reach the Philippines as well with the supervision of Ateneo de Davao University School of Engineering and Architecture Dean Dr. Randel Espina. Discussions regarding EWPH initiated way back 2016 when it was first introduced to the department and its students' executive council. Mrs. Agnes Ward, an active member of EWB in Texas, conducted a brief seminar for the students of ADU last December 2017 to showcase the importance of the roles of engineers in our society. It was only this August 2019 that the membership application was approved by the EWB International, making ADU the official host institution for EWBPH. To know more about us, our projects, or to register as volunteers, you may visit www.ewb-ph.org. To start with the talks, let us call on Engineer Billy Arazanzo, the former CEO of EWB Diliman, for the opening remarks.
Good day, everyone. I was in my third year in college when I joined the EWB on our campus. Back then, I firmly believed that learning should not be confined within the four walls of the classroom. Rather, such concepts must be applied in real-life applications, and what better way to do that than to integrate it with humanitarian purposes, which is what EWB offered me. And my experience within EWB did not disappoint. I was able to sit through seminars and trainings, learning more about renewable energies, design thinking, project management, and other things. I had the opportunity to lead, and I learned well from the members and the experience. I have met various partners that share the same drive for community service, and most importantly, I was able to see how engineering can be brought to the people, most especially to the underserved communities. EWB has led me to various learning opportunities that helped along the way and have shaped me to become the civil engineer that I am today. But one thing I know for sure, there's still so much out there to learn and much more to do. That is why I consider it a great privilege to be part of building up EWB Philippines. I believe it can be a community of like minded individuals that can offer a diverse skill set to bring engineering solutions to those who need them. And what stronger force is there than the collective movement of a group of passionate, hardworking people? This webinar is our service to this community to equip you with the knowledge we believe can help you better serve the people. We hope that this webinar serves you well and that whatever we may learn here materialize in your own different ways. Once again, welcome to the EWB Philippines Webinar Series 2, Build Back Better.
Thank you very much, Engineer Billy. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our first two speakers. Our first set of speakers will be sharing their take on building back better post-COVID. She is a lecturer in climate engineering and former structural engineer, passionate about international development and building resilience in communities to disasters and climate change challenges. Research specialization in climate adaptation, post-disaster reconstruction and recovery, resilience, and the concept of building back better. For information on climate change adaptation, you may follow and subscribe to their climate adaptation platform at www.climateadaptationplatform.com. You may also check out buildbackbetter.co.nz for more information on the Building Back Better research program. Her new book is out now, Resilient Post-Disaster Recovery Through Building Back Better. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Sandika Manakara. With her is Mr. Shankar Niraj, a resourceful researcher with a civil engineering background, having vast knowledge in the career of engineering, disaster management, sustainability, and nuclear energy. He is a graduate teaching assistant at the University of Auckland. He currently takes his Doctor of Philosophy in Civil Engineering at the same university, with his project focusing on developing a practical Build Back Better assessment or planning tool for post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. Let us all welcome Mr. Shankar Niraj.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening to you from New Zealand. Neeraj and I are based in New Zealand, and good afternoon to you over in the Philippines. So firstly, I want to thank you, Engineers Without Borders Philippines. Thanks, Joshua, and a huge thank you to Harold, who invited us to attend your webinar today and speak. So it's really great to connect with you guys, and we really appreciate it. So it's really great to connect from the other side of the world virtually. So it's great. So I will start my presentation now. All right, so I'm here today with Neeraj. We're from the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Auckland. And so as Joshua mentioned, we're here to talk about building back better post-COVID. Now, building back better. You've obviously heard this phrase, and you're probably very familiar with this phrase. It is one of the most popular and famous slogans or phrases related to disaster management and post-disaster recovery globally. And in fact, it is also the presidential campaign slogan for the United States, Joe Biden in the United States. So, you know, it's being used in various different ways. And some of you might be familiar with the United Nations Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. which sets the global priorities for disaster risk reduction, and that's like the mandate that we work under. And the Sendai framework, also one of its 4 priorities for disaster risk reduction is preparedness in order to be able to build back better after disaster events. So it's a very important concept. And so where did it originate? So if we look at where we first heard this phrase, some of you might also remember the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which was one of the most devastating and unprecedented disasters. It affected 14 countries, resulted in nearly 230,000 casualties. So, and the damage that it created was extensive. And it was really the global response to this very devastating disaster was that we need to not just build these communities back, but we need to build them back better than they were before. And that's really how this phrase build back better emerged, kind of like a catchphrase. So it had this redemptive quality that we're not just going to leave these communities behind, we're going to build them back better and better than they were before. And also looking at the case of the Indian Ocean tsunami and a lot of other disaster events, what we started to realize was obviously the reason that disaster events could, become so devastating, or the risks can become so exacerbated, is because of the vulnerabilities that exist in these communities. And not just physical vulnerabilities, not just in the built environment, but also the social and economic vulnerabilities that contribute to exacerbating disaster risk. And this is why, this kind of concept of building back better started to become so important, because we started to look at reconstruction and recovery as an opportunity to actually address these vulnerabilities and build resilience into communities. So the first time Build Back Better was kind of published in an official way was in 2006 in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami with this document, Key Propositions for Building Back Better. This was published by the UN together with former United States President Bill Clinton, that had these 10 propositions of how we can build back better. And so us here at the University of Auckland, we've been studying this concept of building back better in an academic sense for the past 10 years. And so the definition of building back better is about using this recovery process following disasters to improve a community's physical, social, environmental, and economic conditions to create a more resilient community in an effective and efficient way. So here, we really look at building back better as an opportunity during recovery to improve the community, to create resilience. So that's the first thing. And that it's not just about one aspect of a community. Building back better is about addressing all aspects of a community: physical, social, environmental, and economic. So we're improving conditions, we're creating resilience in all these areas. And the other key thing about recovery and building back better is that we look at building back better as a way for recovery to be effective and efficient, because we often find that inefficient recovery processes can actually add to vulnerabilities. So a huge part of building back better is also about effective and efficient processes. So what we've done is we've actually put all this together into the Build Back Better framework. And the Build Back Better framework really encapsulates the concept of building back better and presents it in a much more understandable way. So what this framework shows is we actually present building back better as a 3-pronged approach. So it's kind of supported by these 3 key pillars: disaster risk reduction, community recovery, and effective implementation. And so basically, if you're planning a recovery program, these are 3 key elements that you need to consider in your recovery process. And these 3 pillars are supported by what we call the Build Back Better principles. So for example, we start with the first pillar, disaster risk reduction. So for a typical natural disaster, we look at the improving the structural resilience of the built environment. is one of the first ways of reducing risk. And then we look at multi-hazard based land use planning. So we're dealing with the exposure element of risk. And then we also look at early warning and disaster risk reduction education. So we're bringing in the community and stakeholders through learning and other early warning mechanisms as part of reducing risk. The second pillar of Building Back Better is community recovery. So here we're really addressing those vulnerabilities in a community in its psychological and social aspects and economic aspects, and creating resilience in this through the recovery process. And then finally, the third pillar is effective implementation. So here we're looking at planning and implementing effective recovery. So we look at it through the institutional mechanism that we adopt. So we look at who leads recovery. So, and this is very community specific. So who is best to lead recovery for a specific community? Who are the key stakeholders that need to be involved in recovery? How should they work together? What kind of recovery should it be? What level of centralization, decentralization should we follow? So it's looking at all of those aspects. And then we've got legislation and regulation, which is looking at that aspect of how we can incorporate legislation and regulation to assist us with reducing risk with other resilient practices. And then finally, monitoring and evaluation, which is that continuous, putting in mechanisms for continuous improvement and learning so that we keep on building resilience. So this is the Build Back Better framework that we've developed and we've been working off, and we've used this framework to study recovery efforts over time, around the world. And what we've done is we have developed what we call Build Back Better indicators under each of these principles that are essentially best practice recommendations that actually tell you how these can be put in place in a practical sense. And the next thing that we've done is we've taken this information and we've developed our Build Back Better tool. So this tool is designed for practitioners who are involved with either planning or implementing recovery. And the tool provides a full list of these indicators under each of the Build Back Better principles. And it provides a scale, so a rating system to be able to rate where you're currently at with each of these indicators. So either in the planning process or for monitoring recovery, this is very helpful to understand in terms of building back better best practices, where you're currently at, what your weaknesses are, and what can be done to actually improve. So the tool also provides suggestions for those weak points. So this is, this has been a great achievement, and Neeraj actually led the development of the tool. So this has been, very well received, and it's a great tool to have a look at. Now, of course, at the beginning of this year, we all internationally faced another unprecedented disaster event, which was this COVID-19 pandemic that affected everybody. So we really became interested in looking at how we can build back better after a pandemic recovery. Is it similar to normal, typical disaster recovery? And we wanted to investigate what that was all about. So Neeraj has actually taken a great interest in this, and he's led the research into developing what building back better looks like after a pandemic. So I will now hand over to Neeraj to talk about what he found.
Thanks, Sandhika. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Harold. Thanks, Joshua, for introducing me. I'll share my screen now. So why did we start looking at the pandemic version of Build Back Better? Is that as most of the indicators that we identified for recovering the communities after disaster were applicable even to the pandemic situation in a very similar way. Recovery is still a recovery regardless of what the situation is, and it needs a holistic and comprehensive approach. So for this reason, we started to develop the pandemic version of Build Back Better with the framework, the principles, and the indicators as well. Firstly, we modified the existing Build Back Better framework, which was shown by Sandhika. we just modified the disaster risk reduction aspect of the framework is just because hazard is still hazard. It's been changed from a natural disaster to a biological hazard. So that's the reason we just replaced disaster risk reduction to a just risk reduction and replaced the structural resilience to health sector resilience and multi-hazard land-based multi-hazard-based land use planning to risk-based zoning. Yeah, and so as there were many indicators that were applicable in very similar way, we first started to look at it in a way that it would suit the health sector recovery. So we conducted a thorough literature review on existing key health recovery documents and Build Back Better documents to identify the indicators. Some of the key documents that we used are disaster recovery guidance series, health sector recovery by various organizations, Building Back Better sustainable mental health care after emergencies, pandemic influenza preparedness and response, and WHO Global Influenza Preparedness Plan, all of these documents by World Health Organization, and then institutional and coordination mechanism by UNDP, and this book, Resilient Post-Disaster Recovery through Building Back Better. This book was the heart of this research. Most of the indicators were taken from this book and customized to the emergency situation. So the recovery during and after pandemic is a complicated and high pressure environment, right? And it is necessary to make the organization and community stronger and more resilient to face emergencies or pandemic. For this reason, we, this health sector resilience aspect of this framework focuses on improving resilience of health sector and by having an accurate knowledge of pandemic can direct the communities towards safety. To meet the demand during pandemic, hospitals should be equipped with ample number of health workers, good quality medical equipments, adequate medical supplies, facilities, and transitional arrangements. The second principle focuses on risk-based zoning. So risk-based zoning for Build Back Better requires the creation of risk zone maps based on accurate prediction of outbreak or community spread during the pandemic. It is recommended that revised land use plans based on risk zone maps along with necessary temporary isolation plans should be in place for a successful recovery after a pandemic. So the next principle is about early warning. Early warning and risk reduction education complements improving resilience of the health sector and creating risk-based zoning for reducing risk as a part of Building Back Better. Effective early warning systems to broadcast information to communities living in high-risk zones, like where there is heavy community spread, should be in place to help in directing them to safety. So the next, this dimension has two categories, two principles, that is psychological and social recovery and economic recovery. So issues during pandemic related to social, cultural, religious, ethnic, and psychological factors affect the overall recovery. So keeping the communities informed with the up-to-date information on the strategies, recovery plans is necessary to aid community recovery. Affected individuals may develop traumas due to an overwhelming pandemic environment. So assistance in the form of psychological and in the form of personalized advice, psychological and counseling should be made available. So the next principle is about economic recovery. So recovering economic successfully during or after a pandemic requires an effective tailor-made recovery strategy plan, along with strong commitment and support from the government. So the strategy should empower locals to re-establish livelihoods or adopt new livelihoods and should encourage the adoption of technology in business. So the last pillar of Build Back Better framework is effective implementation. One of its principles is, the first principle is institutional mechanism. So adopting a suitable institutional mechanism is crucial for Building Back Better. The authority needs to have an overarching view of the recovery process, including sector recovery plans, sequences, timeframes, and resource allocation information. The institutional delivery mechanism has to be responsible for establishing the guiding principles for the recovery efforts in line with all the Build Back Better principles, but by creating a tailor-made post-pandemic recovery program suitable for the local community and defining stakeholder roles and responsibilities, and by putting mechanisms in place to monitor and evaluate the recovery effort. The next principle is about legislation and regulation. So the legislative changes can sometimes result in slow recovery, but they can also facilitate the recovery process to create a resilient post-pandemic environment. To ensure a smooth and efficient recovery process, the post-pandemic legislation is required to comply with Build Back Better principles of the framework. So the last principle is about monitoring and evaluation. So this mechanism should be planned and put in place in recovery programs from the outset to ensure effective and efficient outcomes. Monitoring and evaluation for Build Back Better can be used to ensure compliance as well as to improve ongoing and future activities. I'll quickly show you how our tools look, how our tool looks like. This is our Build Back Better tool that is customized for a pandemic environment. So you can you have to fill this form and then click any of these dimensions that you want to go in. So once I've pre-filled this form, so you have to rate your, for example, if you're in health sector organization and if you want to use this tool, go for this indicator, says knowledge of the hazard. So where are you at? Whether are you at poor? Do you know everything about? Do you know everything about hazards, or do you know moderate, or do you have moderate knowledge, or you have very little knowledge? So you have to rate this based on your organization's capacity, and yeah, I've pre-filled this form, and yeah, I'll just do this for you. Yeah. So this is for the second pillar, community recovery. So I pre-filled this form. Just wanted to show you this one. So once you're done with this, you would be popped up with instant results. So you would get recommendations instantly. So you can consider any indicator which has like low rating, and then implement it, and you get graphs, and then you get results for almost every section, and then you have this overall report, chart of all the 3 dimensions. And then we even publish reports something like this. Once you fill out those forms and send back to us, we'll give you a detailed report of how this how you can develop your organization's resilience. So this is a sample results of the Build Back Better tool. So where you can find this tool, you can find this tool on our website. The link will take you, the first link will take you to the Build Back Better tool for post-disaster recovery, and the second tool will take you to the Build Back Better tool for pandemic environment. We have distributed, where did we publish this tool? We actually distributed it to Resilient Cities Venture Center and on our website, buildbackbetter.co.nz. And who got back to us is that we actually got really great response from the users. Some of them are like Portsmouth City Council, Ministry of Internal Affairs and Law of Nepal, International Urban Development Association of France, and a professor from University of Alberta, Canada. So yeah, for more information, please do visit our website and contact either Sandika or me for more information. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for sharing the very comprehensive framework and useful tool on building back better, Mr. Niraj and Dr. Sandika. I'm very curious about the pandemic recovery tool. So later, I hope in the open forum, we'll learn more about this. And with that, I would like to remind everyone to post their questions in the Q&A box at any time for those in the Zoom webinar and through Slido if you are in YouTube Live. You can also ask questions live by raising your hand during the open forum so you can be unmuted. And now, our last but not the least, our speaker is a graduate of MS Civil Engineering in the La Salle University, Philippines, where he received his high distinction honors. He is currently the director for Xavier University Institutional Societal Engagement. He has done numerous research, projects, and publications locally and internationally. In fact, he has been recently awarded with the Best Project Award for Environmental Resilience and Sustainability category on seismic fragility of selected public high schools buildings in Cagayan de Oro City, and first runner-up for Environmental Resilience and Sustainability category on supplementary off-grid water supply for Centro Bayanga, Cagayan de Oro City, both for Xavier University College of Engineering. To share with us engineering resilient communities, let us all welcome Engineer Dexter Law.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. May I share screen? Is the screen seen, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone from Cagayan de Oro, and hello especially to some of my former teachers joining now and to some of my students. Thank you, Engineers Without Borders, for inviting me to share some of our experiences here in Xavier regarding building back better. So I am grateful and I'm very happy that the two former speakers has already provided us the setting of the framework. So now I will share basically just some stories of what we're doing here back in Mindanao. So I call this building resilient communities. These are some stories from the front lines. And I'd like to start with this cover page because one of the things I miss, I don't know you miss these days, is a handshake. And for me who have done work to the frontier, a handshake can go quite a long way to establish relationship and trust and eventually resilient development even in the far-flung communities. So I was being nostalgic about doing field work while we are not allowed to do this lately. So my presentation is but just one quick slide on resilience that we are doing or using here in Xavier. And all the rest are basically stories from the front line. So we are working closely with the National Resilience Council. This is a private sector initiated group, but working closely with government, particularly local government units. And basically our resilience framework agrees with what our friends from New Zealand shared, that it is a whole of society approach. We do not only see the environment or the infrastructure, but really as a whole continuum. You would see, for example, that on infrastructure, a lot of us here are engineers. We talk about housing, buildings, lifeline, but we cannot forget, no, we cannot just say health, education, for example, livelihood will not be part of this spectrum. And quite similar to what our friends in New Zealand did, we also have a scorecard to say that the local government unit has done good or may need some improvement regarding these parameters involved. So, and particularly now, so that's why we were quite well in doing response mechanism, because the health factor here is actually integrated in this resilience framework. The impacts you will see here are basically government system. We consider that a community may be defined as either a formal or informal group of or a fraction or of government, but it can also be the entire local government system. Basically, we want to reduce death and damage, so this also applies to pandemics. And of course, our perspective here is we want to advocate sustainable development. And other than that, I just want to highlight that an empowered stakeholder is one very important parameter in our quest. So I'll just have three stories here, basically, and in about 10 minutes, I'll finish them all. So number one, we hear a lot of doing hand washing in during this time of COVID, and we see the challenge because in many parts of the Philippines, particularly in Mindanao, there are many places that have water challenge or water crisis challenge. So for example, this is not quite far from Xavier University. It's about just basically about 30 minutes going to this place called Bayanga, which was mentioned by the moderator a while ago. But you will see, for example, here it's very clear that this is urban area. While here it's a bit green. This is about quite remote area here. So there is a challenge that this area here or this village do not have good access to clean water. So the problem was, if you also try to see, if you're familiar with maps, it's a bit hilly here. The terrain here is quite harsh, and so that's why even if there's a river somewhere on the, if you can see my arrow, there's a river here, but it takes quite a good amount of power to pump up the water to this area. So again, this is a development issue, but clearly it is quite it is closely knitted to the challenges of the times, like basic hand washing. So what we did, for example, in this case was to introduce an off-grid and doing a ramp pump technology. You will see these are the things I miss doing field work. We do a lot of GIS in XU, but here are real maps, no, that express the real concerns of the community. You see there are markets, there's the river, but the water is absent. And so that's why if you see there's a cave here written in their map, so we have to trace the source, to assess the source. And some of my students were actually doing conversations and focus group discussions with the barangay councils and including the indigenous peoples in this area. And we're able to design some kind of technology here. We cannot go into detail now, which will minimize the use of electricity, because there is water here, but again, the access is quite on rough terrain. It is also people going to the source could be at risk, especially during rainy times when the slopes are quite unstable. So we designed some kind of water system where electricity is minimized or even could be absent at some times. However, just want to go further. We did that project around January last year, but last February, just before the quarantine law or the lockdown was imposed on the communities. So last February, we were able to turn over. This is, by the way, in Sitio Bitu Buadi. No, this is a part of Marawi. You have probably heard that there was a siege about years ago in Marawi, and somewhere in that place, although they have Lake Lanao there, but access to water is quite difficult. And so that's why Xavier, in partnership with other stakeholders, with Coca-Cola, with donors, and IDFI, who also taught us about drum pump. So we were able to place a good water supply system for this community. This looks a bit just about 2 hours travel from the university. But of course, if you are from Mindanao, you know that access to this area is not as easy. There is some cultural, religious conflict that you have to be sensitive in this area. So we're happy. Some of our, initially, this is one of our colleague in the social development office, but we brought in engineers to explain and to train people how to do the maintenance work for this system. But other than that, because safety of water is important, so water quality, we brought in our biologists from the biology department, and even with the Sustainable Sanitation Center to explain how sanitation practices can be improved. I think my takeaway for this story is that other than the technology, it's really the price really of doing this kind of work, of doing resilience work, so that now even during COVID they have now water to use, is the stakeholders become empowered. And I think that is something we are very grateful. The second challenge I'd like to share is we are a lot of local government are talking about recovery from COVID, although a lot are still doing response operation. But for example, in the city, as early as May, this was on around May 6th, I get, or March, sorry, during May 6th. So the mayor actually released an executive order creating a technical working group to come up with the recovery plan for the city. And we were happy, my name is there, as a representative of the university, to become part of that. Now, why did Xavier become part? Other than we have a good medical school, but because we also advocated through years of experience with the city on seeing issues in society and in communities in the perspective of risk. We decide, it has been a practice that we decide the quarantine status of a certain community depending on the characteristic of the hazard or the contagion of the hazard. But I think it is equally important to also see what are the vulnerabilities and the capacities, or which exposed elements are we talking about. And because of this kind of lens that we've been advocating, the city included us, so that in this plan, this recovery plan that the city is doing, it becomes evidence-informed and risk-sensitive. So what we've done is actually to do a lot of learning packets for the technical working group, and basically the many departments in the city were mobilized to do this. But I thought that was just the challenge. But the challenge is actually more on what to do if we are able to assess the risk. This is just one of the sectors that we've been studying for the recovery plan. This is on the education sector I want to share. So we've done systems maps, and I'm glad that we basically just introduced the concept, but it's really the city who did a lot of work together with other stakeholders to come up with systems design and thinking approach. And for example, in this case, it's essential that schools, for example, to continue operations must have at least, I want to highlight here, power supply and internet. And so when we were mapping this, we realized that there are really challenges in many parts of the city. However, distinctly, there's a good story amidst the risk that we've found. Back in 2011, so this was like 9 years ago, we actually installed remote, like a satellite dish. This is what some of my students now are contractors. Balubal is quite a highland village in the city. And so this is actually the school premises. These are school teachers. Of course, there were no students that time. It was summertime in the Philippines. So we installed this. And so we were able to highlight and share stories that there can be done. And I want to highlight that these things are actually developmental. We do not place internet access just because there is COVID. We placed internet access because this was a school primarily many years ago. And now, all the more, it becomes more useful when physical distancing is mandatory. And of course, this is not just done by Xavier. We also have partnered with telecom companies, and even if you've seen some of our partners here with the German agencies. But other than that, moving on, this is an ongoing project. Other than internet, electricity is important. But of course, electricity can also be expensive to some setting. And so that's why Xavier University, together with Ateneo de Manila University, University of San Carlos, ICLEI, Manila Observatory, funded by the European Union, we are promoting this project called CELS, which is Clean Energy Living Laboratories. Our partners who we serve are actually communities, really direct to the communities, local government units, so local governments, and of course, partnering with government institutions, no, Department of Energy, and hopefully policymakers. So very quickly, the project is about doing a GIS-based risk assessment of how sustainable energy sources, for example, in Mindanao, should it be primarily hydro, solar, or wind, or should there be a good mix of these, no? And so that's why another objective here is actually to create a case study as to the best energy mix. So our mechanical engineers are working a lot on this together with the electrical engineers and even electronics engineers. And then, but ultimately, we have to cross boundaries. No, the study becomes transdisciplinary because it cannot be only seen in the engineering lens. So we have invited economists and sociologists in the university to see if this is really also useful or sustainable in that perspective. So again, no, we're saying that building back or from COVID can also become no even more sustainable or eco-friendly if we try to innovate this. My last story is I've seen this news, no, and I come home to my primary work is really on DRR. So I have seen this news in the Philippines, for example, that the contact tracing operations were halted because there was a storm, and more so in Wuhan, no, even in China. So it was a virus, but now it's also flood that they're facing. And the challenge here is we always want to help, but we are limited because of the mandatory distancing needed. Even going to our laboratory in the university has become a challenge because it was locked down. And so we innovated on how we can still do the mission. For us in Xavier, this is a mission, as we term it, no? Because we work with the Jesuits. So what we proposed was actually web-based geospatial risk database for COVID-19 for response and recovery. And so this was, we were glad that the national agencies has actually captured what we've been doing locally. And this is, for example, a training with the National Resilience Council, with the Coastal Cities Project of the Philippines, and the Epimetrics. The Epimetrics is based in the National Capital Region. They actually, I think they also advise the Department of Health on some on the epidemiology of what's going on in the country. You would see that one of our partners is actually the owner of SM. So we are happy that the private sector is really taking its part now, no, other than government and the local government. So we had a 6-day full online training with 6 LGUs and their 6 academic partners all throughout the Philippines. And our coaching and mentoring still continues. I will just going to highlight very quickly 3 added value of this tool or this initiative, particularly in the context of COVID. So again, we were advocating to government agencies that we should look this pandemic in the risk perspective. So it's not just about the cases that we see every day. We also need to see where are the facilities that are already provided by government so that we can either improve them or complement. The private sector can even complement to that. But also, who are at risk that we are talking about? There's a different way, and I'm sure a lot of you who are working on DRR, there's a different inherent vulnerability characteristic depending on what exposure or what exposed element we are talking about. And so that's why, and of course, geospatial, so that it becomes very friendly even to not so technically inclined stakeholders. You can actually zoom in immediately to which village that you are talking about, and you can ask these questions which could probably lead to action points or recovery strategies later. Other than that, we advocated on WebGrid. So we know that GIS software can also be expensive, but with WebGrid, you don't need to install this in all in all software or all in all terminals of the city. But other than that, it's again empowering stakeholders. They can just open this in the app and they can access information. So data becomes information, and which hopefully becomes an intelligence so that people could act appropriately. And then, so this is to continue my story on flooding and COVID. We can easily overlay. For example, in 2011, we had a great flood called Sendong, or that was Washi internationally. So we can immediately overlay, even zoom in and see what are the multiple hazards that could happen in these villages, and why government should prepare even doubly because of this another type of hazard. So again, it's really empowering government, but that trickles down basically to the people in these villages. And finally, when we talk about risk, we cannot stop on the problem. So if there's a problem, so we moved forward just earlier this week. We partnered with USAID, with TTI, DOST. These are agencies in government, that if some of these sectors, particularly in this case, the business sectors, because in the Philippines, I think about 90% of those affected in the economy are in MSME. So that's why we focus on that now. You might say, where is the without border or the frontier story here? But in the Philippines, particularly in Mindanao, a lot of the lower maybe bracket of society are working on MSMEs. So if we do not empower the employer, so the employment will also be affected. So that's why I say we also need to see the bigger picture here, no? But not forgetting, of course, the most affected. So building back better as one, as we quote it. So our role here is to become the technical advisor of these business groups, particularly the small and micro enterprises here, because a lot of them are having problems now on probably logistics. So the transport engineering experts, the university can help. A lot of their problems or challenges actually related to agriculture, because we are here in Mindanao. So engineers can really play a great role here. So let me just summarize into three things, the stories I shared. No, number one, we want to emphasize that we work on this because we want to develop solutions. So not because I think the problem is already clear in the community. So we want to develop solutions, but it's not just for them or for the community or for society, but more importantly with them. We have learned quite a lot, through our experience, that it becomes the success really of the project or the solution we offer is when they feel that they are part of it and they think that it is really useful. And I think I cannot overemphasize, all of us know that. The second thing is the willingness and commitment to trust and collaborate. I know sometimes it becomes so exciting to go to the mountains, but it can also become so lonely and tiring, especially when during the monitoring and evaluation stage. So I think what helped us do these things, sustain these things, was really to trust and the spirit of collaboration. There were times when these areas we went are really armed conflict areas, and so it's hard you can just compute the risk, especially if you're doing risk analysis for so long. But I think trust is very important. I just want to emphasize that trust also doesn't mean that the community need to give every information that we want. Trust is also trusting that there are things that they would want kept on their own, and we should respect that, because especially in a cultural society, very cultural society, I think that has to be respected. Finally, going back to the classroom, as I am a teacher, the insights I got is that, well, the things within the classroom is really useful. So I always tell my students, you study well because this can be used when you go out. But other than that, beyond the classroom, the insight I got, which is I think more important, is now that every equation, formula, map, or table that I explain in class brings a story of people who are probably at risk to dying or at risk to contagion to the virus. And this makes things more important, more relevant to being a human, to being human in this creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Engineer Dexter, for those inspiring and very motivating stories. It's really inspiring to hear multidisciplinary projects that are really for the people and inclusive at its best. And with that, we are now ready to entertain questions. You may type in your questions through the Q&A box or in Slido, and I'll be reading them. Please include your full name and affiliation in the question. By the way, here with us in the panel is Mr. Josel Harold Aquino. Hi, sir. One of our speakers in the last month's webinar. He also specializes in building back better and resilient development. And he is also an alumnus of the University of Auckland and now with the University of the Philippines. For the open forum, I would also like to invite our panelists here in the room to ask questions if you want to our speakers. So I guess I'll just kick off the open forum with my question. To our speakers, what are the common challenges that you usually prepare or that we usually prepare in implementing these building back better initiatives? How did you get the buy-ins from your partners to adapt and execute your programs?
When I was doing a case study, so I asked this question to them, and what kind of challenges do you usually have while implementing these indicators? They usually say that it's because of the traditional knowledge, in the sense like the people sitting at the hierarchy, they don't really want to implement new, they don't really encourage new recommendations. And the second point is they lack capacity in terms of funding or in terms of personnel to monitor and evaluate. So these, like in my research, these two are the only things that I have found out to be more challenging for implementing building back better indicators.
Thank you, sir. How about from Dr. Sandika or Engineer Dexter?
Yeah, so building off of what Neeraj said, actually, buy-in it is quite a tricky thing because there's a lot more at stake. I mean, it's slightly different if you sort of go in working in a community that's already maybe funded through some organization so that you actually, you're there to do that job. But otherwise, especially in like developed countries and stuff, it's quite difficult because of the resource allocations. The funding is done in a certain way, the governance structures are done in a certain way, so it's very difficult to actually create change, and a lot of the times it is the funding that actually creates that block of actually, we'd love to do that, but we can't because we only have this much money and we need to do this first. Time is the other thing. So especially with reconstruction and even sometimes some of the preparedness stuff, even, certain projects are very time bound, even through NGOs or even government-led projects. So there's only so much you can do within that time, within that budget. So oftentimes you end up doing what's obvious and then kind of have to trim off everything around the edge. So yeah, those are some of my challenges, but I'm sure Dexter's got a lot to add to that as well with his projects.
I agree with our friends from New Zealand. It is not easy, and funding is also one important element. But so far, when we do project, and I tell you, maybe as a backstory, there were also a lot of projects that did not work with our experience. No, that's really true. I just want to make this very practical. There are projects that really worked well, but there were also a lot that, well, it did not work. It's either political influence or just it doesn't work. So what we do now in the university is we have this principle called no, don't do harm. So we go to the community, we ask them basically upfront if there is really a need. And well, we tell them that we have some experiences. These are the stories that we did before. But it's important that they affirm that we are needed, because if not, I think it's really very difficult. Although there are many ways for me. There are times when I go to technical working groups so that I can understand the problem better. But there are also times when you just need to really talk to the mayor, for example, or the chieftain, because it works that way in that culture.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Sir Dexter. I
Can
think
I
Sir
add
Harold
something
would
else
like
first?
to add something.
Yeah, so let me just clarify, since we've got a lot of insights from our panelists. So when we go to communities, we don't come to them with a project at hand that we're going to propose to them. That's a recipe for, let's say a recipe for refusal, or let's say recipe for projects that usually don't push through. What we do is we come to them, we get to know their conditions, we get to know what they need, and then we work with them to come up with a project. And in that way, we already have their buy-in once we get to the onset of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Harold. And I think I guess at this point, someone from our audience is already raising her hand. Am I right? Or oh no. Okay. Next question for everyone, I guess. From the tools that you have presented earlier that you have presented earlier, Mr. Niraj and Dr. Sandika, and the stories of Engineer Dexter, do you see any difference or similarities with the frameworks that you've done or that you used for the uh, for your projects?
Maybe I can go ahead. If I understand the question right, if I see similarities from the BBB framework
Yes,
from
sir.
our friends in New Zealand with the ones I use, I think clearly yes. They mentioned about Sendai framework as where it really originated from, and if you see the scorecard that we are also using, it's primarily also anchored with that framework. So I see a very complementary um, uh, principle, no, or framework with these two.
Any thoughts, Dr. Sandika, Mr. Niraj, and any of our from our panels?
Yeah, I mean, I had the exact same sentiment when Dexter was presenting. It's, very, very much the same. So it's great to see that, that this concept is so well understood, and that what we consider resilient recovery is universal. It's well understood that it's beyond what we traditionally used to consider, which was the built environment. It's, rebuilding stronger, bigger, infrastructure, that it's really about the people. And that's one of the most important things about building back better. It's about inclusive, it's about participatory actions, it's about community-led, community-centered projects. So yeah, it was great to see.
Mr. Niraj?
I totally agree with Dexter and Sandika. I don't have any comments to add.
Okay. I think we already have questions in the chat box. And yeah, from our panel, Martel Arrogante has a question.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, speakers. First off, I thank you for such a wonderful and insightful talk. And for my question, it can be answered by any of you po. To what extent do you think policy making either impede or strengthen rebuilding and resiliency efforts, specifically probably in the experiences that you've had or in the country that you live in? That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first because I have a huge issue with policies. I think, yeah, that is the biggest hindrance. It can be the biggest hindrance for implementing what we really want. And so one of the most important things we want to do is even as academic institutions is building good relationships with central government who actually have the ability to drive policy, because without central government usually might have their traditional ways of doing things. And if they're not well informed from the bottom up or from academia, you really never know which way they're going to go, what their priorities are. And especially, policies are driven by governmental stances. So there's so many different issues that come into play. But if you have governments that don't understand that connection between development and risk reduction and adaptation and resilience, it's very difficult to actually put those into practice. And on the other hand, when you do have policies that are very well informed in this way, that merge these things together. And we actually, we've done some work in the Philippines, and we're starting to see that the Philippines, climate change adaptation strategies, and really, I think you've done a lot of work incorporating climate change and disaster risk. So developing those strategies from the top down, it actually helps with bottom up approaches, because, yeah. So it can make a huge difference.
Thank you, Dr. Sandika. Anyone from the panel who'd like to add?
Can I add one point?
Sure.
Yeah, this is with one of my case studies where this policies actually made changes in the speed of reconstruction. So usually to get permissions from the state government, it takes for rebuilding a house, it takes usually 3 to 4 months. But after a disaster, they actually reduced this time frame from 3 months to just 2 days. So they just gave permissions like after verifying the documents, and the reconstruction process was quite quick. So it actually had a really big impact on the project.
Okay. And Sir Dexter?
I think Professor Sandika has articulated it very perfectly.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you, Martel, for the question. And next, I'll be reading off the questions from the Q&A box. I think this is for Dr. Sandika and Sir Niraj. Is the BBB Excel tool presented earlier available for use by everyone? And does it have limitations, or is it only applicable to any country or region given different situations?
Yep. So yes, the tool is available. You can download it off our website. So the links are at the end of the slides, but basically buildbackbetter.co.nz. And there's a tab at the top that says tool, so you can go and have a look at that. And both the traditional, the normal post-disaster reconstruction tool and the pandemic tool both are available on the website for download. And once you do fill that in, the information comes back to us, and we will generate like a summary report similar to what Neeraj showed at the end, and we'll be sending it back to you that shows basically the output of the recovery. Yes, and I think Neeraj just posted the link on the chat box. So one of the things that we really did, so I mentioned, we've been studying Build Back Better for 10 years, and that included a whole bunch of longitudinal case studies in different countries around the world, admittedly in the Asia Pacific. So we have focused on the Asia Pacific. So we haven't done a lot of case studies in the US and stuff, except for literature review. And we've done longitudinal case studies looking at how recovery progresses over time. And we've looked at different types of disasters. We've looked at both developed and developing countries with different governance structures. So one of the main aims of what we have been trying to do is to create something that's universal. So we have taken experiences from all these different countries and filtered to kind of the universal level of what can be applicable to different situations, regardless of, what it is. And also one of the features of the tool that we have developed is actually, it's a non-prescriptive tool. So it's something that you can tailor. So it gives you a whole list of best practice indicators that are universal, but you don't, and there's also, when rating, like you can kind of discard or add indicators however you want. So it is customizable, because one thing that we found in our research is there are certain things that seem to apply anywhere for any type of disaster, which is quite interesting. It was obviously not something we thought we would find, but it was, one of the major findings. There are certain things that apply everywhere. But the other really important thing about recovery is recovery has to be community specific. So there's no one size fits all approach. So every time you go into a recovery, even within a country, you need to look at that community specifically and tailor to that community. And that's what actually creates successful recovery. So as Dixie mentioned, with the community, for the community. So that's, those are my comments.
If I may add to what Sandeep just mentioned, the BBB tool is actually applicable to conflict areas as well. Like Sandeep used it for the case of Gaza in their recovery. So yeah, it's not only for natural hazards, it's also for like man-made disasters. It's not only for developing countries. She also demonstrated the applicability to countries like Australia. And we've extensively used it in developing countries like Sri Lanka, India, Fiji, and a lot of other countries.
And I think to add to that question, is the tool available for distribution for, say, government units, private institutions?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So it is available. So the only thing is, I think I'll hand over to Neeraj. You can tell them what the process is to generate the reports.
So the pandemic tool, it's an Excel tool, but for the disaster Build Back Better disaster tool, it's an online tool. You rate it, and then we receive the ratings, and then we'll send you a customized report for your organization. So, and it's available in our website. It's easily available. Once you visit buildbackbetter.co.nz, there's a tab called as Build Back Better tool. So once you go there, and it's available, or I'll send you the link straight away so that it would be easier.
Okay.
So if you follow this, follow this link, then you can find the tool.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next question we have from Marianito Gallego. This is for Engineer Dexter Law. Normally, activities like this come from universities. How do you think high schools or even elementary schools could conduct such community involvement activities?
First, I am not familiar with the basic education setup, and I'm not sure if there are also regulations that might not be applicable to them. But my primary imagination is that if we are to involve the younger ones, no, I think they have imaginations which also motivate their peers. So if I would create an app or a video of sort, I think in creating these materials, I should engage these age groups as well because they know what hits them, what motivates them. If I'll create a video, then it becomes probably very boring to a toddler. No, so I would involve these youngsters on that. But other than that, I think it is also where we can really solicit a genuine concern of this age group. Sometimes our perspective is probably prescriptive because we are told to we are used to frame in our setup our recommendations on what's the law. But maybe if we are able to to ask them what really matters for a 14-year-old at your age, how do you? I think we need to listen in order to get more useful and effective proposals, no recommendations from them. We need to hear their stories as well.
Thank you, Sir Dexter. I think the key here really is to listen to the people or to the community. May it be toddlers or may it be the community. Okay, next we have a question from Juan Villamor. How do you ensure the sustainability of long-term viability efforts to build back better, given issues on policy as well as funding? I think anyone from the panel can answer.
Maybe I can go first. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is Sir Bong Villamor. No, he's a governance expert actually. Yeah, but anyway, for me, in terms of policy, that's why in our at least in our experience in XU, if need be, that the recommendations be translated into policy, we really do that, no, because there are some projects that could be sustained or could be complemented if there's really policy. And so we do that. For example, in the no-build zones after a flood that hit our city, then this has to be translated into policy. It cannot just stay as is. We rebuild, or even the survivors, we transfer them. But if the place is still free for other people again to build, then there's nothing. We're not going forward. So it has to be, some has to be, and in doing so, what we do in the university is, as I've said, we partner with we have political science units, which and law units, which also provide policy briefs for the engineers. So that's how we do it in the university, so that the technical become crafted into a language of law. No, so that's how we do it.
Thank you, Sir Dexter.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously very key. And the other part of that equation is also I feel like it's in changing culture of people. So it's through education probably. So that sort of links with the previous question of getting children starting to get involved with this type of thinking, and then incorporating this into education as we go on. So kind of that resilience-based thinking, that systems-based thinking, holistic sense of how we teach, what we teach, how they think about resilience, how they think about preparedness and recovery. So yeah, just especially for long-term, sustainability of it, you need the policy part for the funding and for the government and local government, national government to drive these things, but you also need people's buy-in. So I think that cultural shift is important in all aspects, in all sectors and in all communities. So yeah.
Okay. I hope Uh, Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, if I may add, the people should have ownership of the project so that when even when we leave the community, even after we leave the community, the project will continue to be maintained and yeah, it will be sustainable.
Okay. I hope that was well answered. And we have here another question regarding the framework. The BBB framework for post-COVID can be used to other post-disaster scenarios. What are the strong points of the BBB that can be correlated in terms of urban reconstruction, say after an earthquake?
Yeah, so the first, our original tool is the one that deals with natural disasters. So it was, well, natural disasters in the sense, disasters that affect us kind of in a more physical sense. So both conflict and natural disasters, but looking at infrastructure as well as all the other aspects of it. So that tool is what you would use to look at typical reconstruction and recovery. It's that when COVID happened, obviously we all became very interested in COVID and the recovery process, and we were closely monitoring what this recovery looks like and what the decisions they're trying to make in New Zealand and around the world. And it is when these discussions were happening that we realized a lot of the stuff they said for COVID are exactly the same stuff that relate to typical post-disaster recovery. And the only part that was different is obviously, where we reduce risks is through health sector resilience rather than the built environment resilience. And obviously, instead of exposure in terms of land use, we're talking about exposure in terms of the biological hazard. So, where we're looking at risk of where the disease is spreading. So that was the basis for us to kind of very easily adapt this tool to look at what would recovery look like after a pandemic. So that version of the tool is separate, and that is just tailored to pandemic situations. That is not obviously our primary tool. That was just something that we developed just this year, post-COVID, as Neeraj mentioned. He put all the health sector indicators together and kind of had a go at that. Whereas the main tool is obviously applicable for earthquake recovery, and it is something we have used here in Christchurch, and
And as you said earlier, the tool should be community specific.
Yeah, so what we would do is you would look at the tool and then look at what of those indicators are relevant and applicable to your community, and then use the tool in that way. And you might find when you look at the tool that the indicators are a little bit high level. So it kind of tells you, you should be looking at this, but how you actually do it is up to you, because, obviously that will change depending on where you are. So it tells you what the best practices should be.
Okay, very well said. Thank you very much. And I think this would be the last question for everyone. And this is a very interesting question. What can be the role of young engineers in the post-COVID world? Anyone from our panel who would like to answer?
Maybe I can go first.
Okay,
Are
go
these,
ahead, sir.
This one, young professional engineers? No, these are not
Yes.
students.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I work with a lot of young engineers, well, at least fresh graduates. But in the time of COVID, the first thing you must do is you have to also stay healthy. You cannot just go to battle and then just expose yourself to the virus, no? You will just add up to the problem. So please, no, you also need to stay healthy. And then I think there are many ways with the fourth industrial revolution where we can share our knowledge and not necessarily going where there are infection, no? Because again, you don't need to add up in the records of COVID positive. So clearly, as an engineer, you can probably help foremost in the design part of infra-related needs, water and sanitation in particular in this case, but also in housing. I think a lot of issues now is emerging, like how can distancing be really done in slums? And if these slums or if these houses are also cramped because of stay-at-home regulations, are they structurally sound? Or if suddenly if there's a flood happening, what will happen to these houses where the exposed elements are really great at this moment when they stay at this area? So again, even on just the assessment, no, and then of course you cannot implement on your own as of the moment. So the second part, probably, and my final point is you partner. There are a lot of institutions also working on this, no, but even in engineering, for example, here in Xavier. So you partner because you become more powerful by the numbers, especially in this case. But of course, keeping the physical distancing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Dexter.
Yeah, so I guess my thoughts on this is COVID was, like I've mentioned, like unprecedented, right? It affected the whole world. It made us rethink a lot of things. It made us change our lifestyles drastically. It led to a lot of innovation. So now we're actually teaching online, we're working online. You know, whilst before we were so reliant on transport and travel, now we've found other ways to do things. So I hope in a different sense that this gives kind of, you know, an opportunity for our young engineers who are coming into the profession to start to think about innovation and adaptation and have that flexibility, that resilience quality in you, that you don't have to always follow traditional patterns, that, you know, we need to start preparing for the future. What does the future look like? You know, what are the possibilities? I mean, COVID, whereas globalization was such a great thing that happened in the last, you know, 50 whatever years, 100 years, now we actually became crippled because of globalization, because a lot of our exports are, you know, things are coming from far away, so we're not so reliant locally. So maybe, you know, we need to rethink those things. And climate change is another, you know, passion of mine. So I feel like this kind of gave us a lot of insight of maybe how we can rethink how we design and construct things so that we're actually more environmentally friendly. And, you know, so I guess I hope that this also, in a different sense, gives an opportunity for engineers, the young engineers, to be resilient, adaptable, and innovative. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sandika. And Sir Niraj, anything to add?
That was beautifully answered by both.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think Sir Harold would like to say something.
Yeah, one of the things we can leverage in as the younger generation is our adeptness to digital technologies. And nowadays, that most of the industry is shifting towards digital. I think we can spearhead the development of we can spearhead the shaping of the engineering industry into the more digital side.
Thank you, Sir Harold. And thank you very much to our speakers for challenging young engineers by answering the questions comprehensively. Thank you also to our participants and for those who asked their questions, and for participating in our open forum. And to synthesize what we learned today, let us have one of the core team members of EWBPH and the founder of Experto, Engineer Eman Kajimbal. Hello, Sir Eman. I think you are muted, or your speakers are not functioning. No. No, we can't hear you. Still not working. Okay. Okay. Apologies for that. There has been technical difficulties, but I think with all our speakers, we are really challenged on uh, our roles as professionals, as engineers, and as citizens of our country to go back to our communities and more importantly in this season or in this time of COVID, we are really challenged to be part of our communities and contribute to our society to build back better. Let me remind everyone to please accomplish the evaluation form that we'll be providing in a while. Please note that we will only issue certificates for those who filled up the form. You'll be asked questions to assess your knowledge on what did you get from the talks earlier. The link for the certificate will be available after 24 hours through your email. The recording of the webinar will also be sent there. Hello, Sir Eman. Are you available now? I think the mic is not working still. Can you try it again? Okay, it's really not working. We apologize for that. So again, we would like to close this webinar. Thank you again for attending the webinar. Thank you to our dear speakers, Dr. Sandika, Sir Niraj, and Sir Dexter. Thank you very much for inspiring everyone to give back to our communities as we all together fight this pandemic and build back better. I hope we could see you soon on our future projects and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.